What is NANE-INF? NANE-INF stands for not a number / infinity, and it's what happens when you score such a high number that the data used to store that number can't recognize exactly what the number is. Basically, it's too high. And that occurs at 10 to the 308, which in Balatro terms, since we use scientific notation past E10, is E308. So how exactly would it be possible to hit such a absurdly high score? Well, let me introduce you to my good friend, Baron and Mime. Baron gives 1.5x multi per held in hand king, while Mime repeats all held in hand effects. So, with enough Barons and Mimes, would you be able to hit NANE-INF? Well, in theory, if you just have an infinite number of negatives and an infinite number of copies, well, of course. But how many would you really need? What is the lowest possible number of them that you would need? Let's start with the simplest case. Just one Baron and one Mime. However, because we know this is going to be pretty hard, let's think about Red Seal Steel Kings. You get 3 plays of Steel and 3 plays of Baron. The way to wrap your head around all this is to think of your initial play of the Baron and Steel as a Mime, the Red Seal as a Mime. So how many 1.5x's do we get? Well, it's 2 Barons, an actual Baron, plus a Steel, times 3 Mimes, 1 actual Mime, 1 Red Seal, and 1 initial play. So the formula for calculating how many 1.5x activations we get is Mimes plus 1 plus Red Seal times Barons plus Steel. In this case, that's simply 2 times 3. Then you need to multiply that number by how many total cards you have in hand after you play your first card. So let's say we have 6 cards remaining in hand, then it's 1.5 to the 3 times 2 times 6 x mult. Great, now that we have a formula, how do we optimize our Barons and Mimes? Well, for any series of multiplications, if you could distribute the numbers around however you want, you'll always get the highest number when you distribute as evenly as possible. So for instance, if we have 5 total numbers in this case, then 3 times 2 is already optimal. From this we can develop an efficient strategy. If you have an even number of total Barons plus Mimes, then you want to distribute the Barons and Mimes evenly. However, if you have an odd total number, then you want to have 1 extra Baron than Mime. This also applies to the situation of Idle plus Hack and Triboulet plus Sock and Buskin. And it works in all cases, whether you have glass cards, whether you have steel kings, whether you have red seals, none of it matters. This strategy is efficient for all of those situations. Now armed in hand with a little bit of mathematical efficiency, what is the lowest total number of Barons and Mimes that will give us NANE-INF? Well, before we talk about that, we need to talk about the Plasma deck. See, its effect is quite unique. The Plasma deck balances multi and chips, essentially squaring whatever the higher number is if one rapidly exceeds the other between chips and multi. So going back to thinking about scientific notation, if we have a number, say E100, what does squaring it do? Well, squaring it actually just doubles the number after E. This is because exponents act as multiplication symbols when interacting on another exponent. So that magical number, E308, which represents NANE-INF, we can just divide it by 2 if we use the Plasma deck. So let's come up with a random example. Let's say 6 Mimes and 7 Barons, something that would never be able to happen, at least not naturally. With only 5 cards left over, using our formula, you'd only get to E90. And, as I mentioned before, that number of Barons and Mimes isn't really possible. At least not without using a seed searcher. It would seem we are running into a bit of a hand size limitation. Maybe there's a way around that. There is, and it's the boss fight Serpent. You see, the Serpent radically increases your hand size. Each play and discard gives you an extra total of 2 hand sizes each. So, theoretically, how much hand size could we get maximally using the Serpent? How much hand size we have naturally depends on how many ectoplasms we use. Ectoplasm is a spectral card that gives you +1 Joker size, but at the cost of a scaling amount of hand size reduction. This means with 3 ectoplasms, which is a minimum number that we need to use to be able to do any of these strats, we'd be left over with only 4 hand size, and that's assuming we hit both hand size vouchers. Also, assuming we have the maximum number of discard vouchers and play vouchers, that would mean if we start at 4 hand size, there would be 10 total plays and discards that we could get to farm our hand size. And if you profit 2 hand size per, then that's 24 total hand size. However, we still need to actually play one of those cards, so it's actually 23. So let's go back to the handy dandy formula we made. How many, if we did have those 23 hand size, with the same number of barons and mimes, would that be? Well, it'd be 8 times 8 times 23, which is E259. Well, we only need 154, so that clearly blows way past the requirement. Now we have a different question. Assuming we have 23 hand size, what is the minimum number of barons and mimes to be able to hit NANE-INF? Well, that's pretty easy to answer. All you do is subtract 1 baron and mime until you get a number below, and it's the one above. That is 5 barons and 5 mimes, is the lowest number of barons and mimes that you need to be able to hit NANE-INF with 23 hand size, or E170. But wait a second. If we hit E170, it seems like we have room to spare now. So we have another question. What is the minimum number of hand size that you need to be able to hit NANE-INF, given that you have 5 mimes and 5 barons? Well, you can do the exact same process again, and we find that it is 22 total hand size, with 21 actually remaining in the hand after you play the king. Phew, that was a lot of math. Okay, now that that's out of the way, how do we actually get 5 mimes and 5 barons? And we still need to hit the serpent, guaranteed, in order to execute this strategy. One hurdle you have to overcome no matter what to get multiple copies of the same card is simply rerolling. In Balatro, rerolling costs a substantial amount of money, especially compared to other games, so we need to find a way to generate an absurd amount of money, preferably really quickly, and with a way that works with the jokers that we need to keep in the first place. Well, let me introduce you to Midas Mask. Usually seen as a relatively weak joker, it is certainly anything but, especially when used like this. I think that solves our question for how to get all the gold, but how do we get all these copies of Baron and Mime? There's essentially 3 different ways to get multiple copies of Baron and Mime. One is to find Invisible Joker, which after a certain number of rounds held in hand, he copies a random other joker in your hand. Another is Showman. Showman allows you to receive multiple Tarot, Planet, Spectral, and Joker cards in the shop and in packs. The last way is to find Blueprint or Brainstorm, whose effect is to copy the effect of other jokers in hand, based on their positioning. What about the joker slots that we need to be able to fit in so many copies of Blueprint, Brainstorm, Mime, and Baron? Seeing as there's 3 ectoplasms and we need 10 total jokers, that means we need 2 negative copies of Mime and Baron. Wait, 2 negative copies of Mime and Baron just straight from the shop? Even just asking for 1 natural copy of a specific joker is impossibly rare. We can't even think about getting 2. Seeds in Balatro are interesting. You see, if the same player plays the same seed the exact same way, all of the outcomes will be exactly the same. That is to say, if I were to roll the shop 5 times, and another copy of me were to roll the same shop in the same situation 4 times, their next roll of the shop would be what I saw on the 5th roll. Maybe you can see where I'm headed with this. Yet another crucial element of getting this many copies of Baron and Mime is to find negative skip tags specifically on the small blind. Why specifically on the small blind, you ask? The reason is because the shop rotation that you have resets every ante. So after the boss fight, you need to set up the shop, and then you still have to skip one of the fights. This means that only on the small blind will a skip negative voucher be able to force out a negative on a specific joker. Another thing that's worth mentioning is ectoplasms being a crucial element to increasing your joker size also has a significant drawback. You see, the reduction in hand size generally lowers your power level, but you need that power level to be able to keep continuing the run. So, you actually also need to be able to quickly hit another copy of Baron and Mime to make up for the lost power. Well, one idea is to say, can't you just keep winning over and over again by using the Serpent strategy repeatedly? Well, this does work, but there is one little niche that gets in the way of endless runs specifically. And that is that every 8th ante is another boss fight. And unlike every other fight, you can't reroll a boss fight into the Serpent, which puts us on a hard clock, ante 24. But aren't we forgetting about something? Isn't there something else we also need? We also need to get an absurd amount of red steel kings. Now normally this wouldn't be so hard to do, especially on Endless. All you really need is to find a red steel king, queen, or jack from a card pack, use strength on it, and then add steel, and then follow it up with 1,000,000 deaths. Not really a problem normally. However, A, we're limited to ante 24, which is not as much time as most Endless runs typically get, and B, because we need so many copies of Mime and Baron, we're running Showman. Showman hurts us because normally any tarot cards that you keep in your consumable area or that show up in the shop will actually not be able to be repeated when you open up a tarot pack. This radically increases the chance of finding a specific tarot card, especially when you get extra consumable slots. This also has an effect on natural tarots you see in the shop, but with Showman, that advantage is removed, which makes it much more likely to not see the types of tarots that you need. We need 5 Barons and 5 Mimes, an endless supply of gold to reroll enough times to find those copies, 2 negative skips on ante 1, tons of spectral packs to find 3 ectoplasms, but also it'd be very nice if we could find cryptids to make the deck building process much quicker, and preferably an immolate that deletes no face cards. That does sound feasible, but you probably need to use a program to search through the extreme number of seeds to narrow down your odds of finding such a lucky seed. Blitzaboy. Blitzaboy was hanging out in the general chat of the Balatro community Discord, and he was posting about his runs and accepting tips and advice when I noticed something interesting. He had 2 copies of Mime and a negative Baron on ante 5. Wow, that certainly has potential, so I asked him to share his seed. What I found was nothing short of spectacular. For starters, immediately off the first fight, you find an immolate. And it doesn't hit very many face cards. This does a lot of things. One important thing it does is filter down the number of cards in your deck so you can reliably find your kings. But another thing it does is get your economy started right at the beginning. Also gives you the money to afford the first ante's voucher, which happens to be a boss reroll voucher. This is important because in the early antes it's very easy to run into a fight like the plant and have no way to survive. We also happen to find an early Midas Mask and an early Castle. Chip-based scaling actually works really well with Plasma because you're squaring the number of chips you're adding. We also hit an early Queen with a red seal and a strength to immediately turn it into a red seal king. We find Troubadour and Juggler to be able to farm an absurd amount of money. This seed doesn't just have potential. I think this is the seed. But does it have negative tags specifically on the small blind? And does it have spectral packs with at least 3 different copies of ectoplasm? And how about finding all those copies of Baron and Mime? even with a showman? Well, using the showman to find copies of cards is actually pretty annoying, because every time you increase your joker size limit, you then have to find another copy of showman first to then be able to start rolling copies of Baron and Mime. Unless you happen to stumble upon a natural negative showman, but what are the chances of that? One way to give us extra time to get all this set up is to use the minus anti-vouchers. You see, the problem with that is normally the minus anti-vouchers, especially for endless shenanigans, are a straight benefit, because once you get far enough into the game, you've used so many tarot packs that your strategy that you use to win is completely consistent, and so losing a play or a discard doesn't really hurt you. However, we're using the Serpent, and so these minus plays and minus discards are costing us hand size at the end of the game. Well, we only need 22 hand size, and we have 24, so what we actually need is to only use one of them. Unless we could find another way to get +1 discard, but there's no way to do that, right? But we still also need to find the skip tag that lets us get extra coupons in the shop. We have everything. We have everything we need, right? Well, as it turns out, there's still one more hurdle we need to overcome. See, you actually need to play those 4 initial plays in order to increase your hand size, but with so many copies of Mime and Baron, because what happens is you end up defeating the blind. If only there were a way to strategically change how much power is in a hand. Well, there is, but for that we need to find a few more copies of Blueprint. All we need to do now is move our blueprints so that they're actually not copying anything at all. This is it. We've done it! We just have to click play! Did you notice? I forgot to move the blueprints.
Failure.
We're still on ante 23, so luckily we have one more chance to actually do it correctly this time.